Okay, so welcome back to Intro to Sociology Summer A Lecture Program class. Um, just wanting to get everything squared away for this week. So last week you should have watched the first day of class lecture, which kind of lays out everything that has to do with the class and what we're gonna like how the class is laid out and what we're gonna discuss and the syllabus and everything like that. Your exams, your essays, things like that. Um, then you should have watched a lecture and looked at the PowerPoints on the sociological imagination, which was not necessarily created by C. Wright Mills, but more so kind of brought to light by C. Wright Mills in like the 19th. And then you should have looked at a lecture called Theory and Methods. And the Theory and Methods section just kind of just lays out some of the major theories in sociology, as well as the ways in which sociologists collect data. Again, this isn't a deep sociology course. This isn't a research methods course, so I'm not going to go too deep into it, but just kind of give you an overall idea of how a lot of this data is collected, so that you know that it is scientifically sound. Um, and so now, and you should have completed the assignments about that, as well as I think there was a discussion post that you were supposed to complete. And in addition to that, there was a quiz. There was a quiz last week on that topic, the sociological imagination. So hopefully you completed all of that. And now this week, one of the things that we're going to discuss is white privilege, male privilege. Okay. White privilege, male privilege. And so we're just going to start by just kind of talking about privilege as a whole. And then we'll go into the various parts of the various social constructions, the main kind of social constructions that we talk about in sociology. So if you want, you can go ahead and open up your PowerPoint, and you can go ahead and follow along on the PowerPoint as you listen to and look at this lecture. If you look at the PowerPoint, the next slide is your class assignment. Okay, your class assignment. And your class assignment says, describe your world how it is, and now describe your world how you would like it to be. Okay, describe your world how it is, and then describe your world how you would like it to be. Right. And so I just kind of want you to do some basic reflection. You don't have to like tie anything from any lectures or readings or anything like that. I just kind of want to get an idea of how you understand the world, how you see what your initial sociological imagination looks like. Okay. And it could be anything. You can talk about your immediate world, your community, your neighborhood, your family, or you could talk about the world at large. You can talk about ways in which the world at large has advanced in your life. And you can also talk about some of the issues that you see in the world at large, maybe based on what you've seen um, maybe based on what you've seen in the news, or what you see on social media, or what you hear about on the radio, or anything like that. So these are some of the things that I want you to talk about and discuss in your class assignment. Again, not super, super deep. We will get into some other things where I would want you to kind of bring in stuff from the readings and the lectures. But for right now, I don't want you to you don't have to do that for this. Address the above statements on a Microsoft Word document in detail. I want it to be We can make this like 1 to 2 pages. Nothing too deep. Double space times New Roman 12 font. And this assignment is going to be due before May 27th at 11:59 p.m. Okay. So that is when this class assignment will be due, and it'll be under where you see on Canvas where it says class assignments. And then obviously you'll see on the module 2 where you'll see where all of that is. So very, very simple. Just a quick reflection. Some things to think about before we get into go really deep into some of these sociological topics. All right, let's get into it. So privilege. Obviously you're not in class. We're not like in a traditional class setting, so you don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to. I guess I'll raise my hand since you can see me, but I can't see you. But I want you to raise your hand if you identify as a male and consider yourself sexist. Okay. And raise your hand if you identify as white and consider yourself racist. So just kind of think about that, right? If you identify as a male, do you consider yourself to be a sexist person? Now, it's likely that most people who identify as a male probably would not consider themselves a sexist person, right? They probably would say, no, I'm not sexist. I don't believe that men are better than women, right? I don't believe that women should be beat down or subjugated or oppressed. I think that people should be treated fairly based on their ability to do something, based on their skills, whatever. I believe in fairness and equality. Most people would say that, right? Most people would say that. Raise your hand if you identify as white and consider yourself racist. Most white people would not consider themselves racist at this point in time, right? At this point in like US history. There was a time where embodying the racist ideas of the time was significant to the advancement of a white person. For example, in like the 1950s and even in the 1960s, if a white person got on TV, on a media platform and said, I'm a staunch racist, I'm a staunch segregationist, I believe that the races should be separate, I believe that the white man is the leader of this country, they will be met with cheers, they will be met with a parade, and they will probably win elections in certain states, right? After the civil rights movement and after the kind of the expansion of more quote unquote liberal ideas, after the victories, some of the so-called victories of the civil rights movement, it is now not as popular to suggest that one is racist or to embody a racist identity, right, among white people. It's never been popular among Black people or people of color to want to support someone who is openly racist. But now, in this day and age, even if a person, or it's rare that you will find a person to come on a platform and embody the identity of a racist and say that they are racist and say that they want things separate. And that's an uncommon approach, right? A lot of quantitative research shows that if you were to outright ask a white person, do they believe in racist ideas? Do they believe that white people are better than people of color, or that a person is better simply because of their race? Most white people will say no, right? Most white people will say they don't adopt those ideas. So this is kind of where we start when we talk about privilege, where people are at this time, right? Most males will not consider themselves sexist. Most white people will not consider themselves racist. Then there are a few that understand the internalized effects of sexism and racism. There are a few males that understand, while I may be a feminist, while I do believe that men and women are equal, I also understand that there are things within my culture, there are things within my maleness that may cause me to be sexist, whether I try to or not. There's still growth that has to occur because I have been socialized and inculcated with sexist ideas from a sexist society, right? There are some white people that understand that while I may not personally want to see people of color or non-white people suffer at the hands of racism, suffer at the hands of inequality, and though I may not like to see those things, I also recognize that there may be things that I may say, things that I may do, thoughts that I may have, preconceived notions that I may perpetuate that could reinforce racism and racist ideas because of the fact that race and racism is, again, indoctrinated into me, into my society. And it's something that I have learned since I was a child, right? So because of that, a white person may say I am racist, or a male may say I am sexist. Even though I try not to be, sometimes it still comes out because of the society in which I live. And it is a constant thing that we all have to fight against our own, whatever our privileges may be. So some people may argue that point. And that's a good argument. Some people may agree, some people may disagree. But it's a solid argument, okay? So white privilege, by Peggy McIntosh says this quote: "White privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks." I want you to look at that quote and I want you to think about what it means to you. Take some time to do that. And you can pause this video if you need to. White privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack. That right there alone is a pretty powerful statement. Number one, what she's likening this notion of white privilege, and not even just white privilege, but privilege itself. She's likening it to, first of all, saying something that one cannot even see. There's a book by one of my colleagues, and it's called Race in the Invisible Hand. And it talks about the way in which race and racism works as this thing that you can't really see. Obviously, we can see racial groups, but then the overall structure of race is something that we can't see. It is a set of ideas. It is a set of oftentimes of policies that work out in ways that can be very difficult for us to pin down specifically in all formats, right? You can, my wife keeps on it. You can see, yes, you can see a policy, but then there are other traditions and ideas and ways of being and norms within society that deal with race or that deal with sexism or gender inequality that are not seen. And that then translates into privilege. Privilege is oftentimes something that a person cannot see. They cannot pinpoint it, especially if the person has the privilege. And it's not until someone brings it to their attention that it becomes visible. So the privilege the structural inequality itself can be invisible, but then also the privilege itself is absolutely invisible. It's invisible. It doesn't hold any weight, so you don't feel it weighing you down. In fact, in many ways, it can actually lift you up, right? And you don't even realize it. But you don't feel it. You can't see it, but it is something that you have at your disposal. It is all of these resources. It is provisions. It is codes. It is their roadmaps that privilege allows you to have that you don't realize you have, that you don't feel, and that you don't see. But the people who don't have the privilege, they see it. So if anything, the people that don't have the privilege feel the weight of not having the privilege. Women feel the weight of not having the privilege of being a male. People of color, and particularly Black people in this country, feel the weight of not being white, feel the weight of not having white skin and seeing, and it is visible because they see how white skin allows for people to navigate life. Women see how being a male or male identifying allows people to navigate life in a much easier way. But people who have that privilege oftentimes can't even tell. That's why Peggy McIntosh says it is invisible and it is weightless. And not until somebody brings it to your attention can you even see it. And then sometimes when people bring it to our attention, we still don't want to see it. It has to be something outright, something egregious that then makes people say, whoa, okay, maybe there's something to this. All right. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So just to do a quick kind of like background on this notion of privilege. So this idea of privilege is oftentimes cynically discussed as a term that has only really become recently fashionable, right? Especially among people who consider themselves to be progressives, liberals, academics, right? But the idea of privilege really goes back to, at the very least, the 1930s. At the very least, when W.E.B. Du Bois talked about what he calls the psychological wage of whiteness. See, sociologists overall look at privilege as unearned benefits that accrue to particular groups based on their location within a hierarchy. So the first thing that has to be understood when we're talking about privilege is that privileges are unearned. It is not something that you have based on any type of merit. And that's the first thing that can become difficult, especially for US citizens, because and we're going to talk about this more when we go into racist America, but it can become difficult for particularly US citizens to understand the idea of having something that you didn't earn, because that's the basis of the US story. The basis of the US story is this group of people, this country that was oppressed by the British. And so they fought their way to this revolution, to this freedom that changed the world. And then is this idea of having this land of opportunity that people can come to. And if they work hard enough, and if they have a good idea and they pound the pavement and they work hard at that idea and they work hard to get an education, then they will be successful in the land of opportunity, because that is what the United States provides that no other country provides. Every other country has this theocracy, or has, the rich getting rich and the poor getting poorer, and, have all of these unfair laws and based off of these archaic, old, ancient beliefs in caste systems and things of that nature. And America's not like that. We have fought so that people can be treated fairly and equally based on their hard work, and that alone. That's the American philosophy. That's the American story. That's the idea. And so it's hard when a US citizen then takes this course, or anybody who lives or works in the United States, especially if you're white or you're male, to take this course, and somebody says, yeah, that ain't it. That's actually the exact opposite. Actually, the United States is built very much on a caste system. If you read Isabel Wilkerson's work, she's a phenomenal, I want to say she used to be a lawyer, but she's a journalist now. And she's written 2 New York Times bestsellers. One is called The Warmth of Other Suns, and the other one is called Caste. Fantastic pieces of work, where she talks about the caste systems that exist within the United States. And it's difficult to accept that there are actually things that people, not even just individuals, but whole groups have, benefits they have that they did not earn. And it makes people feel like, well, how can you tell me I didn't earn it? All of the things that I did in school, all of the work that I put in, the time that I put in to build this business, how can you tell me that I didn't earn it? Yeah, there were some things that you earned, but then there were also things that were privileges to you just because of how you were born. If you were born male, if you were born white, if you were born, if you are heterosexual, if you identify as within the Judeo-Christian belief systems, there's a certain privilege there. If you are an able-bodied person, if you are not differently able, right? All of these are privileges. And so sociologists say that these benefits are unearned. It just depends on how you were born, and it depends on what group you fall into, or what group you are able to socialize yourself into. And that group is based on a hierarchy. And that hierarchy is based on the rules of society at that time. So the idea, and we're going to talk about this more in another lecture, is that our society is stratified. There are certain groups that are higher than other groups in society, not biologically, not universally, but in our society, it is true. There are benefits to being of a certain race. There are benefits to being of a certain gender identity, a certain sexual identity, etc. And so there's a hierarchy. Males, females, non-binary people. There's a hierarchy when it comes to society. White people, people of color, and then even within people of color, certain people of color have benefits that other people of color don't. And that can be argued in so many ways. There are some benefits that there's a certain way in which Asian Americans are looked at in society that Black people and Latinx people don't have. There are certain positive attributes that some people see in Asian Americans that they don't see in Black people, African Americans, people of African descent, people who are Latinx. Right? At the end of the day, though, when we look at the spectrum, regardless of how various minority groups fit within, at the high end, in terms of race, you have white, and at the low end, you have Black. And then everybody else kind of fits in the middle, and then Native Americans probably fit more so alongside Black in terms of what they've experienced at the hands of the US and Europeans in the Western Hemisphere. So that's kind of the spectrum. That's the binary of white and Black. and then everything else kind of falls in line with that. But there's absolutely a hierarchy. There are ways in which certain groups have more benefits than other groups. And so based on that, that has been created by society, that has been created by history, then there are benefits and there are challenges that fall within those. And those unearned benefits that apply to certain groups, that is what sociologists call privilege. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois, who is one of the founders of sociology, one of the fathers of sociology, but we'll talk more about Du Bois later. A phenomenal figure in our discipline. The first to do many things, but definitely the first to sociologically break down race. Talks about this. He's the first person to graduate with a Ph.D. from Harvard. We'll talk a lot about Du Bois in like a future lecture, probably like next week or something. But Du Bois in the 1930s released a piece, published a piece. And in this piece, he talks about, I believe it was in a piece called, I think it's Dark Water, which was a collection of essays. So I don't know exactly when he wrote each one, but I believe the whole piece was published in the 1930s. But he talks about the psychological wage of whiteness. And the psychological wage of whiteness, what he says is, although he himself would have been considered an elite Negro, part of the Black capitalist, part of the Black middle class, because he was a professor, he had a PhD, he had respect from certain white people, he had access to resources that a majority of Black people did not have because of his social status. But then he also understood that when looking at poor white people, even though he himself may have had more money than poor white people that he may have encountered, that there were still benefits, there was still a psychological benefit that these white people had. There was still, poor white people still received psychological wages. And these psychological wages allowed for them to feel superior to poor Black people. And this isn't new, this dates all the way back to Bacon's Rebellion during in the antebellum South, right? Where white people were given opportunities and benefits, even poor white people that were just above the enslaved Africans, so that they could feel that they would have something to lose if they joined forces with the enslaved Africans and fought against the elite whites. Because there was a time where many poor white people said, well, we're not doing really any better than them. Why don't we join forces and fight the people that are raising taxes? Fight the people that are keeping us from having jobs, that are keeping us from being able to feed our families. Why don't we go up against the elite white people, the super wealthy white people? This was, I think, in Virginia in the 1700s. And they did that. And that's a lot of people. You have all those enslaved Africans, you have all these poor white people going up against those few very, very rich white people. And they weren't successful in the end, but it caused the elite whites to say, we need to do something so that these people don't join forces, because if they do, we're going to be out of power. And so they gave poor white people a little bit more land, a little bit more opportunity. They began to make even more clear the racial hierarchy that exists and allow for benefits to be provided to poor white people that enslaved Africans did not have, so that they could still see themselves, while we're not as well off as the rich whites, at least we are not as bad as the poor Black people. And so when Du Bois talks about this in the 1930s, he's mentioning this and he's providing a sociological explanation saying that these are the wages, psychological wages that even poor white people have. We understand why rich white people may feel as though they have a superiority to Black people. They have money, they have resources, they have networks, they have a life that is clearly different from this group. But now the psychological wage of whiteness says that even if a Black person and a white person are making the same amount of money, they're both in poverty. What he's saying is that the psychological wages that society gives to the poor white person allows for them to still feel just a little bit more superior, simply because they're white. So whatever shortcomings that the monetary wages bring to the poor white person, a white person can still count on the fact that they will have a higher status than a Black person simply because of their skin color. It is an unearned benefit that is innately provided to that particular group based on the hierarchy of race in our society. And so this is where we really see the notion of privilege being laid out in such a way, particularly within the sociological discourse. So then after Du Bois talks about this notion of the psychological wage of whiteness, then a couple of decades later, C. Wright Mills, a white man, also points out this idea of privilege, right? Talked about C. Wright Mills and the sociological imagination. And he brings to light this idea when he says that it's not only attentive to privilege, this idea that certain groups have benefits that other groups don't have, but also to how it tends to be invisible and it's unacknowledged by its recipients. So just like we said earlier, when Peggy McIntosh says it's an invisible knapsack, it's not only invisible, but the recipients don't even acknowledge it. I don't even realize that it's there. So there's a book called The Power Elite that C. Wright Mills talks about, and he discusses the idea of these unearned benefits and of being counted as a member of the upper class. He's talking about it in terms of social class. If you're a part of a status, if you have a certain type of job, if you have a certain career, if you have a certain amount of money, there's still some people who believe, well, because I have this, or just because I have this, it doesn't mean that it's unearned. Or it doesn't mean that I don't have setbacks. And that's true. A person with an upper class can have setbacks, but there's also these innate advantages that exist among the power elite, among people who have resources and money or networks or access. And he says people with advantages are loath to the belief that they just happen to be people with advantages. Oftentimes they don't like the idea that they were just lucky. They were born into this. Because like we said earlier, that goes against the US philosophy. That goes against this idea that I didn't work hard for what I received. Because then it means that, well, we're really just perpetuating what was done in Great Britain. All we did was just do the same thing that they did, just in a different way. In some ways, and in some ways it was the same way. So people with advantages don't like this idea, but it's true. And in the 1960s, there was a scholar named Theodore Allen who took a page out of Du Bois's book, and he began to write about this notion of the white skin privilege. So this idea of privilege is not something that is new or novice to our society. our discourse around race and class and gender, this is something that people have been talking about for a very long time. There's a whole history around privilege that even goes further than sociology. All right. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And I want you to click on this link. And I want you to see this reaction to privilege, right? This reaction to the idea that privilege exists. So click on this link. I want you to watch this, and then we're going to talk about it. Okay, so you paused the lecture video, you watched this video. Now, coming back to it, kind of think about some of the things that Tal is saying. And what is he saying that we talked about already when it comes to privilege? And then what are some things that Tal is saying that maybe he's not understanding when it comes to privilege, right? So you can think about that, pause the video, and then come back. And it seems as though what Tal is arguing is that to say someone has privilege, it is a sort of a prejudicial position. Just as wrong as it is to treat someone who is non-white as less than human. It sounds like what he's arguing is to assume that someone who is white has privilege, which is also a type of discrimination. So that is his position. He also argues that because his family members are Holocaust survivors, that the idea that there is a certain level of oppression that is tied to his genealogy, that is tied to his history, that he says it's laughable to suggest that in turn, his white skin has allowed him a privilege to get into a certain school or to have certain opportunities. One thing about privilege that I think some people don't understand is there can be privilege in some areas of life and not privilege in other areas, right? That's what we call intersectionality. So as a Black male, I would not necessarily say that because I'm Black and because there are certain struggles attached to being Black, particularly a certain history that even Tal admitted to, that is attached to being Black. Because of that, it is laughable that I have male privilege, right? It sounds like he's kind of making that same idea. Because his family is connected to a Jewish level of oppression, then that cancels out the white privilege that exists in the United States. Again, the level of oppression that was performed on Jews was in Germany. So for sure, in Germany during that time, one would not say that Mr. Tal is privileged. It's clear. However, being white that was 2014. In 2014, Mr. Tal would be considered privileged. As a Black male, as a Black person in society, I would not be considered privileged. But as a male in society, I am considered privileged. And both of these things are true. You can be privileged in one part of the world or one part of society or one time period and then not be privileged in another. You can be a white woman and be privileged as a white person and not be privileged as a woman. You can be a person of a certain ethnicity, of a certain race, and not be privileged in one area and then come to the United States and be privileged in that area. That's literally why people moved from Europe, escaping the Irish potato famine, escaping Italians, escaping, I don't know if it was Mussolini, but there were certain dictators that Italians escaped. Then they came to the United States and they were not privileged where they were from. They came to the United States and they received a certain level of privilege because their identity was different. Now they're not just looked at as Italians. Now they're kind of integrated into white society that allows for them to be privileged. A person can have both. And I think that's something that Mr. Tao does not understand. That goes back to the social construction of race and the social construction of identity and ethnicity and gender and all these different things. These things are socially constructed, which simply means that society dictates the definition. Society dictates what whiteness means, what non-whiteness means, what maleness means. To be Black in 1822 is different to be Black in 1922, and it's different to be Black in 2022. To be a woman is different from being a woman in 1822, before the first wave of feminism in the late 19th century. That's different from being a woman in 1922, and it's different from being a woman in 2022. What it means to be these things vary based on where society is at that time. That's why it's called, that's why these things are what we call socially constructed. Okay? So there was just a couple of things that Mr. Tao, it appears that he does not understand when it comes to privilege and took offense to when reacting to privilege and reacting to this idea that he has privilege, right? And so it leads us to then go to this quote by C. Wright Mills, which we talked about earlier. He says, people with advantages are loath to believe that they just happen to be people with advantages. They come readily to define themselves as inherently worthy of what they possess. They come to believe themselves naturally elite, and in fact, to imagine their possessions and their privileges as natural extensions of their own elite selves. In this sense, the idea of the elite as composed of men and women having a finer moral character is an ideology of the elite as a privileged ruling stratum, and this is true whether the ideology is elite, made up for it by others. So we kind of see where C. Wright Mills is helping to kind of explain the psychology of the power elite, the psychology of the privilege, and what they may understand, and then also what they may not understand. And so what Peggy McIntosh does, now we're going into the reading, what Peggy McIntosh does is she breaks down the idea of male privilege. She breaks down the idea of male privilege, right? And what these privileges are. And sometimes this can be a lot easier for certain groups to understand. Sometimes it's easier for people to understand the gender perspective before they understand the race perspective. And then for other groups, it may be easier to understand the race perspective before they understand the gender. Right? So we're going to talk a little bit about male privilege first, and then we'll go into white privilege. So male privileges. There are certain special privileges, that's the next slide, and status that are granted to males in patriarchal society. That is what male privilege is. The special privileges and statuses that are granted to people who identify as male, whose society also identifies as male. That is what male privilege is. And let's look at some of these things. First of all, before we go into what these advantages are, male privilege is embedded not just in the male body, but it's also embedded in the structures of society. And that's what we're really going to talk about. Meaning that society, meaning that social institutions naturally, not naturally, but over time, have offered privileges to people who identify as male over people who identify as female. So that's why we say that these things are socially constructed, and there are social institutions that are inherent in perpetuating this. Sometimes they realize it, sometimes they don't. And it takes oftentimes people who are outside of that identity to help bring that to their attention. Oftentimes it'll take a woman to say, you don't see how this is marginalizing women. That's why it is important to have diversity among input when people have diversity within positions of power. Because there are things that people outside of that identity construction can understand and can see that people within that identity construction cannot. For example, there are things that women can understand that exist within male power structures that men oftentimes, again, because of the invisible knapsack of privilege, are just like, oh, I thought this was just, oh, I didn't know that. And then it takes a man who understands male privilege and who's humble enough to say, I see what you're saying. We have to make a change. I didn't realize that this was perpetuating sexism, or I didn't realize that this was a privilege that I had. When a woman begins to talk about her experiences and how she may not be able to do certain things that man can do. So some of the positive advantages. Men oftentimes within male privilege can get access to adequate nutrition, shelter, and health care, particularly health care, in a way that women oftentimes cannot. These are some of the advantages of male privilege, right? These are some advantages of male privilege. When we talk about healthcare, there is a certain way in which, or there are certain way in which doctors, and they've even admitted this, how they deal with men and men's bodies that are different from how they deal with women and women's bodies. Women are oftentimes seen as, particularly Black women, especially Black women, but women in general, are often seen as these beings that can take a lot of pain. Right? I was just watching this, well, let me stay right there for a second. And so because of that, oftentimes when women, but especially Black women, and there's research to support this, Black women specifically, when they complain about being in pain, when they complain about their body, oftentimes medical professionals don't believe them. It's documented. Serena Williams dealt with this. She almost died having her baby because of this. She forced the doctor to deal with something that she felt her body was telling her. The doctor said she was delusional. She said, no, I'm not. Forced them to get her another doctor to deal with it, and come to find out she was right. And had she not advocated for herself, she would have died having her child. There have been women who have died having their child. There's a organization led by this man whose wife died having their second son. And she told the doctors that something was wrong and they didn't believe her. She was a Black woman. There's actually quite a few stories like this. I can go on and on. But again, that's part of the male privilege. If a male says, hey, this hurts, usually a doctor will say, what's wrong? Let's find out, especially a white man. But I don't even know of a lot of Black males who have that issue, usually with, somewhat fair doctors. But women always have that issue, especially Black women. So healthcare is even different based on gender. When you have male privilege, you oftentimes, when it comes to adequate nutrition and shelter, with male privilege, most times you have more access to economic resources. With male privilege, you get paid more, if we just want to go straight there. So with wages, higher wages comes better food options. With better food options comes better nutrition. With higher wages comes ways in which you can get better housing. Better housing comes better shelter, right? So there are positive advantages to male privilege. What are some of the negative advantages? I don't know if there's such thing as negative advantages, but I guess the negative um setbacks or something, negative positioning. Um, when it comes to male privileges, accompanying male privilege includes such things as the expectation that a man will have a better chance than a comparably qualified woman for being hired for a job. That's the negative parts of male privilege. There's this automatic idea that, well, if we hire this male, he's going to be better at this. Even though the male and the female, the man and the woman have the same exact degree, have the same exact time in the field, experience, they have the same exact awards. Yeah, I think the male will be better at the job. And then men oftentimes get paid more than women. And so the women then receive the negative setbacks from male privilege. Women are oftentimes looked over when it comes to jobs. Women are oftentimes paid less when it comes to jobs. Right? Oftentimes men are assigned authority over women in the workforce. And some people may say, well, that's just because men go into fields that are very dominant fields: business, architecture, large corporate industries, politics. Well, because they're the ones that are going into these fields of power, they're going to be the ones that are dominant. Well, how then do you explain caretaking industries, education, social work? Right? There are men who oftentimes are assigned authority over women in these traditional caretaking roles. Male nurses oftentimes get paid more than women nurses. And nursing is, generally speaking, a caretaking role, a caretaking industry, largely dominated in terms of numbers by women. Yet male nurses are oftentimes paid more than women nurses. So then how do we justify that? By social privilege. So why do you think so many men, if we see that these things are so blatant, they exist in our society in a way that it should clearly be evident, why do you think so many men deny privilege in the way that Tao denied this white privilege or white advantage? Let's look at the next slide. The reason why so many people deny male privilege is, again, because it is something that is totally anti the US philosophy of working hard and receiving rewards. The US philosophy is built on meritocracy, which is the belief that you get somewhere based on your merits. And so it's very difficult for men, especially, to say, you're telling me that I did not work hard to have everything that I have, that something was given to me. Does it make you feel like a man? Part of the masculine identity is working hard, being aggressive, forcing something to happen, and then it happens. Being given something, being handed something, is something that is for the rich or the lazy, not for a good, hardworking man. So the denial of male privilege oftentimes is within a spectrum. Some people look at the denial of male privilege as someone who says, no, men and women are equal. I don't know what their problem is. I don't know why women are complaining. So let's look at this spectrum, right? And let's look at it from one end to another end. One part of the spectrum is men must be central in curriculum because they have made the greatest contributions to civilization. This is probably a person we would call a misogynist. That's male privilege at its finest. Men are the greatest. We've done the greatest work to society. These women haven't done much of anything. And so men should be studied. Men should be understood. We want to uplift men because that is how we uplift our civilization. That's how we've gotten this far. And that is how we're going to continue to be a great people, a great human race. That's the not exaggerated. There are a lot of men who believe this, but that is the extreme version of male privilege, right? And even though a lot of men probably do believe this, a lot of them probably won't admit it. But it is this extremely misogynist, extremely male-centered idea. Most men probably would say, okay, let's be real. Right? Clearly, men and women both have contributed to society. We know that. So a lot of men believe this, but most men will probably say, okay, that's a bit much. So you have that extreme version. Then you have this version. Well, there's a lot of males that say, yeah, male privilege does exist. But it doesn't lead to unwarranted success among men. So a lot of men will say, yeah, I can agree that I'm privileged because I'm a male. But it doesn't mean that that's why I'm successful. I'm successful because I worked hard. A lot of men fall into that category. They don't want to attach merit. They don't want to detach themselves from meritocracy so that they can admit that male privilege exists. Then you have this next statement. Well, sexism exists, but it's not systemic. So they can say, nah, we do. Yeah, it's clear. Men have better opportunities than women. And even in corporations, there are definitely businesses that provide benefits to men over women. But I don't think it's systemic. I don't think it's a part of our society. I don't think that's structural. I don't think that that's in the entire medical industry and the entire educational curriculum and the entire housing system and the entire financial system. No, it's not that. It's the same way in which the people who are anti-critical race theory say, yes, racism exists, but it's not systemic. It's not a part of the American system. Because our system is fair. Our system is just. Our system ensures that regardless of your race, criminals get put in jail and people who don't do anything wrong are not punished. It's not systemic, but there are just a few bad apples. Sexism exists, but it's not systemic. There's just a few misogynists. And then, so again, we're talking about the spectrum. Then you have this next part. Some agree it is systemic. Some men will say, yeah, our system prefers men over women, or give opportunities to men over women, but denies that they have personally benefited. But I personally haven't benefited from that. I've seen it. But me, going back to unwarranted success among men, I personally have not benefited from that. I have gotten everything that I have because I work for it. And then some agree with male privilege. They agree that patriarchy exists, but don't think that we can do anything about it. Some say, listen, I know that it exists. I know that people have benefited from it. I know that I've benefited from it as a male. But what can I do? I wish I, oh, I wish I could just change it all today. Wish I could just snap my fingers and everybody be treated equal and everything be okay. But what can I do? And then the last one, almost all men, I don't think I've ever heard of a man, actually maybe once or twice in a situation. Almost all men will refuse lessening the importance of men or redistributing resources from men to non-men in society. You will find people all through the spectrum, but I would probably say almost 100% of men, if you were even among men that says we need to treat women equal, sexism is systemic, it's structural, it's wrong, blah, 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 and we got to do something about it. And I believe in voting policy to make sure that women are treated equal to men and blah, 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 blah. And they'll go on. And then they say, okay, so then if that's the case, then we're going to raise taxes just a little bit for men and redistribute those tax dollars to women organizations and women-owned businesses. Ooh. And people be like, wait a minute, I didn't say all that. Most people not going to be okay with that. Let's just be honest. Most people not going to be okay with that. Right? So redistributing resources to women or anybody who identifies as a woman, a lot of people will be mad. Even those people who are staunch feminists, men particularly. So there is a spectrum of denial of male privilege. Goes from the very egregious, men are the greatest, men have only made contributions to civilization, to we need to fight for women. Women need to be equal. But I don't want you to take my money and give it to them. I want to keep mine. Right? So I want you to read the uploaded document. I uploaded a document on U.S. male privilege checklist on your module. And on a separate piece of paper, I just want you to write the number of any statement that positively applies to you. And then after that, we're going to discuss it. Okay, so go ahead and do that. Pause this video, come back, and then we're going to discuss it. All right. So if you read this U.S. male privilege, you'll see things, a couple things like my odds of being hired for a job when competing against female applicants are probably skewed in my favor. The more prestigious the job, the larger the odds. If I'm never promoted, it's not because of my sex. If I fail in my job or career, I can feel sure that this won't be seen as a mark against my sex capabilities. If I have children and pursue a career, no one will think I'm selfish for not staying home. I am not taught to fear walking alone after dark in average public spaces. So you see all of these various issues. Every major religion in the world is led primarily by people of my own sex. Even God in most major religions is usually pictured as being a male. And so you see all of these different descriptions, and in looking at these descriptions, if you can probably say that these things apply to you, a lot of these things apply to you, then it means that there is a certain privilege that you have. And a lot of these things we don't even realize until it gets laid out for us in this way, right? Some of them, sure. But even things like something about walking home after dark. Now, clearly, regardless of your race or gender, there are certain places you don't want to be at certain times, or if it's dark, you're going to be on guard. But I have literally heard of women say things like they have to think about parking very, very close and sometimes pay more money, especially in downtown areas, close to where they are, because they don't want to walk if they know they're going to be walking at night. Okay. And then, and I've never had to think about that before. If I don't find a close parking space, then I'll just park far away, and then I'll just have to walk. Or women will oftentimes have to befriend men that they trust and may have to leave someplace early or go somewhere, even though they're not ready to go, so that they have somebody to walk them to their car. Like these kind of things I've never thought about, because I've never, even if I'm somewhere where I know that something may happen, I've never had to think that far ahead. But women do. I remember I had a woman colleague. She was getting her Ph.D. around the same time as me. And she wanted to start a family with her husband. But she had to think about and plan out when she would start a family and do that after she got a job and had that job for a certain amount of time, so that her being pregnant would not impede upon her getting a position and furthering her career. And I never thought about that. I never thought about, if I had a child, would that stop me from furthering my career? But women have to think about those things. And men don't. That's male privilege, right? And not until I actually had a conversation with my woman colleague and she explained that to me did I say, wow, this is really real. I never thought about that. And she said, you never would, because you're a male. You never have to think about it, right? So these are the things that when we look at male privilege, we look at this checklist, we see if a lot of these things, if you as a person who identifies as a male, if you were able to check off and say this applies to me, then Peggy McIntosh is saying, yes, you benefit from male privilege. If you have a significant number of numbers on your paper, then you benefit from it. All right. So in the same way, going to the next slide, in the same way that many men are oblivious of their male privilege, many white people are oblivious of their white privilege. Because white people are often taught that they are normal, that they are mortal, that they are average, and they are the standard and ideal for society. When you see television shows, a lot of the television shows, a lot of the representation of white people are very universal. If you look at television, there's something called BET, Black Entertainment Television, or TV One, right? Or Telemundo, right? There are channels that are specific to certain groups of people, particularly of color. And there are white people who may say, well, why is there a BET? Why is there not a WET? If there can be a BET, if there can be a Black entertainment television, there should be a white entertainment television. If there's a Telemundo, there should be a white, whatever, right? White channel. Where are the white channels? All of the other channels. ABC, CBS, CNN, TNT. Is TNT still up there? I don't even know. Every other channel is white because every other channel has images of white as normal to the point that we don't even realize it. And the images of Black people are oftentimes limited. The images of people of color are oftentimes limited to certain stereotypes. And so then there's a need for a channel to show the dynamics in the humanity of people of color. Because white people are often, white people or white images or white representation are just normal. You see the good white person, the bad white person, the rich white person, the poor white person, the middle class white person, the white person who's the hero, the white person who's the villain, the white person who's quirky, the white person who's funny, the white person who's serious, the white person who saves the day, the white person. You see white people in all aspects of human life. But with people of color, you generally see this one side. Now things are starting to change little by little. Now we might get a show like Blackish on ABC. Very good show. I think ABC did a great job with that show. That actually shows a Black family in a very normal way. Dealing with race, right? A lot of race issues and things like that, but just in a very normal kind of regular way that shows rich Black people and poor Black people and Black people from the hood and Black people from suburbia and educated Black people and non-formally educated Black people and Black people who are gay and straight and transgendered and all these different types of, but this is very new, very new. Even if we look at white schools, white universities are just called universities. University of North Florida, University of Florida, University of Miami. Black schools are often called historically Black colleges, and there is a certain, it all is almost seen as kind of like abnormal, right? Something special. Whiteness is oftentimes seen as normal. This is everyday. It is often seen as the standard. What is the standard of academic success when it comes to college? Harvard, Yale, Princeton. These are the standards. And then everything else falls below. And these places are historically white, majority white, benefiting by and from white people. So white people are often taught that they're normal, they're average, they're the standard, they're the ideal. And this is a part of white privilege. And this is why many white people oftentimes can't see, don't want to see, or deny the idea that it exists. So I want you to go to the uploaded document from your reading, and same thing that you did before, right, with the males. I want you to do the same thing with the white privilege, right? If you scroll down, you'll see a checklist for white privilege that shows you, again, the same thing for male, how or what white privilege looks like in terms of while looking at a checklist. So go ahead and do that, and we will then talk about it. So I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time, right? Certain things you see. I can talk with my mouth full and not have people put this down to my color. I can be sure that my children will be given curriculum materials that testify to the existence of their race. If I have low credibility as a leader, I can be sure that my race is not the problem. I can easily buy posters, postcards, picture books, greeting cards, etc., and see pictures of people of my own race, right? So again, looking at this, you see that very similar in the same way in the male checklist, the white privilege checklist, these are things that oftentimes apply to white people. And it's important for white people to see this checklist to say, wow, I never really thought about like I could just pick up a card and it's gonna have white people on it. I don't have to worry about whether this school is gonna be good for my white child. I don't have to worry about making sure I move into a white neighborhood because the neighborhood I live in, I'm probably gonna be around white people most of the time, right? I don't have to worry about even buying a band-aid. I don't know if you read that one, even buying a band-aid and how band-aids are just kind of geared towards white skin because that is the norm. Oftentimes I'll have to worry about seeing negative images of myself and not wanting my children to see a negative image of white people, even if you see a white person who does something wrong. That may not be indicative of white people. There was a shooting in Buffalo, New York. Hate crime. But it's likely that a white person didn't say, man, you know what? This is making white people just look really bad. No, generally what's going to be said is that guy is spewing hatred and we do not need a person like that in free society. Right? But if that was a black person, right, or person of color, if you talk about the Virginia Tech shooting and the Asian male who participated in that, people made that indicative of Asians in general, right? If that was a black person, that would have been indicative of black people in general. Because oftentimes people of color are not given the privilege of just being different. Oftentimes the same level of resistance does not exist. Somebody told, I was watching this interview of Mark Lamont Hill. He's a Temple University professor, Morehouse College professor, well-renowned author, historian, sociologist. And he talks about how Ronald Reagan there was a attempted murder on his life in the early 80s. Literally a man and you can see video of it in documentaries and stuff. The man literally just walked up to him and was very close to him and just pulled out a gun and shot him. White. Pulled out a gun and shot him. Secret Service, everything, everybody scattering, everybody protecting the president. They get the guy, they arrest him. This guy who shot the president, tried to kill the president of the United States in the early 80s, so arguably the most powerful man in the world, was then found guilty of attempted murder. I think it was attempted murder. And then he was sentenced to, I believe, a psychological program to deal with his mental health because they concluded that something was wrong with him mentally. And he was isolated from society for like maybe 20 or 30 years. And now this man is out. He's a free man. A white male who tried to kill the president of the United States is now out and is a free and contributing citizen to society. That ain't white privilege. I don't know what it is. Because I think we can all safely say that anybody who tries to kill the president likely would, there's no trying to reason with that. Try to kill the president, you're gonna, especially if you're a person of color. This white male was seen as being mentally unstable, again, isolated. So I guess a type of prison or a type of program was put in place to deal with his mental issues. And now he's free. That's privilege for sure. Right? And so seeing that these things exist in our society is the first step towards hopefully making a change. So let's look at what happens if a white person admits their privilege, right? I guess very similar to when we looked at the denial of the male privilege. If a white person admits their privilege, looking at this next slide, then that means they come to the realization that meritocracy is a myth. And again, we talked about that several times, so we don't have to go too deep into that anymore. But again, wow, this thing that I believed in terms of this US system, that if I get what I want in life if I work hard, is actually not all the way true, right? Or not all the way true for every person. The privilege of being able to belong and still criticize the system. So another thing that happens when white people understand their privilege is they realize, oh, I can still criticize the system that I live in, but still feel like I belong to the system that I live in. I can still feel like I'm a part of this country, even though I say that this country has done things wrong to Black people and other people of color. It is the admission of privilege that allows for white people to participate in a Black Lives Matter rally or Black Lives Matter protest, understanding that the likelihood that anything negative happening to them, or the likelihood that them being arrested, or the likelihood that they will be hurt or killed significantly decreases because of their skin color. They can critique the system, but still feel comfortable saying the Pledge of Allegiance. They can critique the system, but still feel comfortable singing the national anthem, right? So these are things that, this is a certain part of white privilege. They can still criticize the system and belong to the system at the same time. They can still criticize the system, but still feel like the United States is their home, right? They still have an identity. Non-whites must adopt white behavior, attitudes, and thoughts to become successful. That is another admission of privilege, when it is realized that even people of color oftentimes cannot be their true authentic selves, because to be their true authentic selves is oftentimes not acceptable or deemed appropriate within certain aspects of society, i.e. hair. Oftentimes Black women can't wear their hairstyles the way that they would like to, because it is not seen as appropriate, even if white people wear the exact same hairstyles. There is very rarely, at least from what I understand, a hairstyle that a white woman could wear that would be seen as inappropriate, as long as, I guess, it's a done hairstyle, if you will. Like, obviously, maybe, you know, hair all over the place or something like that may not be deemed as appropriate in maybe a workplace. But then again, some people may look at that as being cool and edgy and eclectic or whatever, right? But if a white person, if a Black person wears that hairstyle, it may cause them to not get a job, cause them to lose their job, which is why California and other states have had to pass the Crown Act to help ensure. The Crown Act is an actual policy that was passed on the state level to help ensure that Black women and other women of color, or any person of that matter, is not discriminated against based on their hair. There was a situation in Texas where a young man could not walk with his class and graduate with his class because he had locks that came to a certain length. And there was a whole thing about it. I forgot what happened, but what ended up happening. But a lot of times non-white people have to adopt white behaviors and styles to be successful. Non-white people are erased or seen as unsuccessful in their attempts to be white. So even when they try to act white or do what white people feel is or do what may make white people comfortable, they're never going to be seen as fully accepted. They're always going to come up short at some point, no matter what. What happens if a white person admits privilege? Then they admit that they were given permission not to hear the opinions of people of color. There are ways in which If they don't want to hear all that Black Lives Matter nonsense, all this equality, they could just cut that off. They do not have to suffer. They don't suffer from the critiques of people of color, i.e. words that are used to disparage people of color versus words that are used to criticize white people. We all know the words that are used to disparage people of color, especially the N-word. And these words are used, they are, oftentimes they're not accepted in the larger society, but we know that they're still used. But the words that are used to criticize white people, some people may say, well, those are just as bad as the words that are used to criticize people of color or to disparage people of color, particularly the N-word. Saying white trash is just as bad as using the N-word. I saw a meme that said using the word Karen. Karen is now well, I'm pretty sure you all know what Karen is. It's part of the kind of the new age lingo. And calling a white woman a Karen is just like calling a Black person the N-word. No, it's not. But some white people like to take that on to do exactly what Mr. Tao did, which is to show this idea of reverse discrimination or reverse racism. And it's not. The N-word is a much more disparaging term that was literally used while people were being lynched, while Black people were being enslaved, while Black people were being killed, while their kids were being, like, we can just go on, like the violence is unreal. And I've never heard of that word being used to a white woman while she was being killed or lynched, or her children were being taken from her. It may hurt her feelings, but that's about it. It may make her feel bad in the moment, but there's no way that that is in connection. So the words that are used to criticize white people are very different from the words that are used to disparage people of color. Whether it's Black people, Asian people, Latinx people, those words are much more harmful because they're connected to actual policies. They're connected to a history that has led to the deaths, that has led to the ostracization of people of color, where their lives and their children's lives and their children's children's lives were set back in real ways because of this word, because of these words. What happens if a white person admits privilege? They then realize that they have been protected from societal hostility, violence, and distress. Their skin alone does not allow them to have to deal with the hostile nature of our white society, the violent nature of US society, and the distresses that come with being a person of color in US society. So going to the next slide and coming towards our conclusion, we got one more slide after that, after this, is that privilege means you have something that everybody wants. Not to say that everybody wants, not to say that every person of color wants to be white. That's not true. In fact, most people of color like being their race. Most Black people like being Black. Most Asians like being Asian. Most Latinx people want to be Latinx. They don't want to be white. They just want to have the privilege of being white. They want the freedom, the normality of being white. So based on what we just discussed in the last slide, is maleness and whiteness really a privilege? See, now we're breaking this down, but then now we're gonna deconstruct it. Now looking back at it, is it really a privilege? Because this kind of privilege allows you to be thoughtless. And it allows for a person to be everything from thoughtless all the way to violent. Is that really a privilege? Yes, there is a privilege in how a person can move throughout society, but it is whiteness and is maleness a privilege to your humanity and allows you to be thoughtless and allows you to not see the reality of the world in which you live in and can allow you to be violent. It is a privilege, but then it's not a privilege. It's actually more of a privilege when you can see the reality. This is what Du Bois talks about when he goes into double consciousness. We'll talk about that soon as well. That's why he calls it a gift and a curse. Sometimes a privilege can be a gift and a curse. It's a gift and now you can move throughout society, but it's a curse because it puts a blindfold over what is really happening. So not all, when we talk about privileges, and that's why we have the arrow going from thoughtless to violent, not all privileges are inevitably damaging. Sometimes you can have the privilege of just being thoughtless, and then you can also have the privilege of being a part of a white organization like the Ku Klux Klan who can wreak havoc and not receive the backlash that other groups might receive. So there are these societal benefits that are solely applied to race and gender, but then you also have sexual identity as well. That is also a privilege. It is a privilege to be heterosexual. It is a privilege to be able to hold hands with your love or your partner and not have to get stares from other people. Right? So in conclusion, the obliviousness about white advantage, like male advantage, is inculcated in the United States, and this maintains the myth of meritocracy and keeps power in the hands of certain groups. The questions remain, do we use our unearned privilege to weaken systems of disadvantage, or do we reinforce it for future generations? So that is then what we leave this lecture with. Yes, now we understand the privilege. Yes, we understand the unearned benefits. What do we do with it? Do we reinforce it? Or do we use that privilege to make a change? As a male, do you use your privilege, recognize your privilege, and say, now I'm going to open up opportunities and make things different for women in the future, for my daughters, for my granddaughters, etc. As a white person, do you say, yes, I have white privilege, and now I'm going to use it to help people of color so that our society is actually what the US history books say it is, which is, and make it a democratic, egalitarian, equal society. Okay. Next class, or this is the class assignment at the end. So I want you to see if you can see evidence of what we've just discussed in Chelsea's journey. I don't know if you've ever heard of Chelsea Lately, Chelsea Handler. She had a show called Chelsea Lately, and she talks a little bit about her journey towards understanding her privilege. And so I want you to watch this video. And in a 1 to 2 page document, I want you to discuss the ways you see white privilege and other concepts of privilege from the lecture in this interview. I want you to make connections between these key ideas in the lecture and how they are evident in Chelsea's life based on this link. Your assignment must be double-spaced, Times New Roman, 12 font. Be sure to use concepts from the reading or the lecture in your answers. And this assignment is due before May 27th at 11:59 p.m. Okay, so yes, that is it for this lecture. Make sure you complete any assignments that are assigned to this lecture. And I hope you have a great day, great week, great weekend. See you soon.